as you go into the sanctuary, you have pomegranates and gourds and flowers and angels kind of depicted, or cherubim depicted. And so again, it's kind of this Garden of Eden in the midst of the people, where God dwells with his people. Just like the Lord walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, where is the Lord with his people? He's with them in the temple. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Renewal Bible in a Year podcast. This is week 14. My name is Pastor PJ Arsvold, and this is a ministry of Renewal Church in Denver, Colorado. And we are all up in the thick of things when it comes to the kingdom. And as you're going to see today, we're going to be moving from one kingdom under David to his son, and to a really important split, and then a bevy of kings on both sides. And so I'm excited to jump into that with you. So we're just going to go right in. Just a reminder of where we're at. Last week, we wrapped up with chapter 18 in 2 Samuel, where Absalom, David's son, is killed. He was leading a rebellion. He had kind of taken over kingship. David was in kind of fleeing in exile. He had crossed over the Jordan. He had left the promised land to try and flee for his life. But they were able to ultimately win a victory on David's side. And while David had given a command not to kill Absalom, Joab had gone ahead anyways and had him killed because he was usurping his father. And we ended chapter 18 with the news being brought back that David had won, but David finds out that his son Absalom dies, and he starts weeping and saying, "Oh, Absalom, if only it would have been me instead." Which leads us to chapter 19, where this week's reading starts, because what ends up happening is Joab, the commander of the army, he hears about this and he goes to David and he rebukes him. And he says, "You've brought so much shame on us because you have all of these people. You have soldiers, you have men and women, you have your wives, you have your sons and daughters who fought for you, who risked their life for you. They stood by you. And clearly we mean nothing to you because we know that if we were all dead, but Absalom was alive, apparently you'd be fine," right? He kind of calls him out because this was supposed to be a day of faithfulness that God showed to David. And people who fought and stayed by David's side are now being like, "Oh, I guess he cared more about that guy who was trying to kill us than he does about us." So Joab calls David out. And it's interesting. He says, "I can see now that you hate those who love you and love those who hate you." Now we're, as Christians, called to love even our enemies, but we're not called to we're not called to hate those who love us, right? That's the problem. Is Joab saying it's one thing to have compassion on Absalom, but it's at the expense of your care for those who stood by you. So David does kind of pull himself together. He sends word to Judah to basically say, "Hey, take me back." And as we'll see going forward, there's a little bit of battling between the tribe of Judah and the rest of Israel over David and over his return. But what ends up happening is David sets Amasa as commander over Joab. So Joab's been his commander, but Joab's gone rogue a couple times. He murdered Abner, that was Saul's commander, who was trying to defect to David's side. He murdered Abner and to avenge his brother, even though they now had peace. And now he went against David's wishes in killing Absalom. And so he sets Amasa, who was Absalom's commander, basically says, "Amasa, you're now my commander." And then he begins pardoning some of his enemies. So some of these people who had wronged him during the time of exile, David pardons, which is one of the reasons why David is shown as kind of such a merciful figure. Because you have Shimei, who was of the house of Saul, and was cursing David and throwing stones at him. And basically, at this point, Abishai, that's Joab's brother, wants to have him killed. He's like, he should be killed for how he mocked you and cursed you. But basically David says, there shouldn't be any death in Israel today. It's reminiscent of when Saul had his first big victory and then people wanted to put to death those who'd questioned Saul's authority. And Saul says, "Hey, this is a day the Lord has worked out victory. We're not going to kill anyone. We're not going to ruin that victory." It's kind of like that. David is ultimately pardons Shimei and says, "As long as I live, basically, I'm not gonna kill you. It's okay." And then goes on to confront Mephibosheth. And if you remember, Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son, so Saul's grandson, and he's lame. And David took him into his own house and let him sit at the royal table. On behalf of his father Jonathan, he has kind of extended this graciousness. And then when David had to go into exile, Mephibosheth's servant Ziba came up and was like, hey, I'm with you. And then David's like, where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba's like, hey, he's dancing around and he's saying that this is God's vengeance on you for dethroning his father. So Ziba had said that Mephibosheth basically was rejoicing in David's hardship. Now Mephibosheth shows up and says, no, that's not the case. I couldn't walk. I'm lame. And Ziba cast me in a bad light, right? He lied about what had happened. When he shows up, Mephibosheth is kind of untrimmed. So he looks like he's not been taken care of. And so David is a little bit at a loss. And here's this, and it does seem like Mephibosheth's probably telling the truth that, he was just kind of left there. He doesn't look like he's been living a good life. And he seems very humble at David's feet. Could just be for mercy. But regardless, David had given Ziba all of Mephibosheth's land and property because he had assumed Mephibosheth had defected. So ultimately what David ends up doing is just dividing it, basically saying, all right, this was Mephibosheth's, I gave it to Ziba, you guys just split it half and half. And so ultimately nobody is punished for this, but they kind of split the inheritance. He also shows faithfulness to Barzillai, who had helped him during this exile. Barzillai is 80, and so he's like, well, I don't really want to come sit at the king's table. I'd like to live in the place of my father and mother and be buried there. But on behalf of his faithfulness, his family is ultimately blessed by David. And then David recrosses the Jordan. So again, I think this is a significant point. This is kind of a mini exile and a preview of when we have an exile later. But the Jordan is the entry point to the promised land for the people. In Joshua, it's where they crossed over to enter the promised land. When David had to cross over, he was leaving the promised land. He was kicked out of the place, but now the Lord has brought him back. And there's some bickering that's going on between Judah and the rest of Israel over whose king he is and who welcomed him back first and so on. And then it leads to chapter 20 where a man of Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, named Sheba, basically yells out, we have no portion in David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So basically he's saying, hey, fine, Judah, you guys take your king. He apparently he's your guys' thing. He's not our king. So he's rejecting David as king. And we're told that Israel follows Sheba. So a bunch of these Israelites who are there with David, they leave with Sheba and basically say, we're going to tend to our own matter. You're not our king. You take care of Judah, that's fine, but we're going to go do our own thing. You're not our king. And what ends up happening is that David's going to send an army after Sheba to stop this rebellion. He initially wants to send Amasa, but then Joab tricks Amasa. He comes up like he's just greeting him. He looks like he's going to give him like a kiss of greeting. And then he grabs him by the beard and stabs him. And Amasa is ultimately killed. And so Joab is just this interesting character because in some ways he seems like a good military tactician and he's done a lot of good for David. And he also has now murdered Abner, who was Saul's commander. He murdered Abner when Abner came over to David's side, because Abner had in battle and in war defended himself and killed Joab's brother. And now when David sets up a new commander and takes over Joab's place, Joab kind of defends his turf and murders Amasa, who's innocent in this case. So Joab, again, kind of just a power play kind of guy. He's kind of rogue in a lot of ways. He's got some wisdom and some abilities, but also just doing all sorts of crazy things to kind of protect his own family, his own status, and his own power. And so Joab murders Amasa, and then Joab leads the army to go after Sheba. And what ends up happening is they get to this town called Abel, and they're basically like going to attack the city. And this woman sticks her head out and is like, what are you doing? Right? Like, don't attack us, don't hurt us. And Joab says basically like, hey, we need to get this Sheba guy. And the woman says, let me go talk to them all. So she goes and talks to the leaders of the city, and basically they come to the conclusion that it would be better to hand over Sheba than it would be to have their city destroyed by David's army. So they behead Sheba and they toss his head out, right? And so the war is kind of over and they once again have victory. And then chapter 20 kind of wraps up with just an inventory of David's kind of officers, whether it's Joab, his commander, whether it's the different people who work in his forced labor. So those would be people who do kind of manual labor in service of the king. We have recorders who keep track and obviously record things for us, and then the priests and so on. Now in chapter 21, we have this interesting story where we're told that there's a famine for 3 years. And so David suspects that this is something that the people have done wrong, that the Lord is punishing them. And this makes sense because one of the things specifically for Israel going to the promised land was if you obey, if you listen, right, I'll send rain in its seasons, you'll be fruitful. If not, I'll withhold the rains, there'll be famine. And so David can tell something's up. A 3-year famine is significant. So he goes to the Lord, and long story short, he finds out that Saul had wronged the Gibeonites. So just a reminder who the Gibeonites are. That's that group of people that when Joshua first got into the promised land, they pretended to be from like a far distant place. They were like, oh, we're from a far land, make a treaty with us. And then they did. They made a covenant that they would not hurt the Gibeonites. They would not attack them. They were not going to be enemies. And then they found out that the Gibeonites were just like up the street. And so from that point on, Israel had honored its commitment, its oath. We will not hurt you. And so this is a story that's unrecorded for us. We didn't have this captured in previous passages like in 1 Samuel. But apparently at some point, Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah and kind of for the people of God, right? He broke that covenant and put to death these Gibeonites, or put together a number of them. And so committed this atrocity and brought blood guilt kind of on his family, on Israel. And so David goes to the people and basically says, hey, what to do to reconcile this? And so basically they want some of Saul's descendants to be hung as kind of a life for a life, right? That's the justice. There was a murder done, and we want basically it repaid. And it's one of those, again, it's David is typically displayed as merciful. This seems to be that this is the Lord's will, that there needs to be this punishment. We talked about earlier, right? God punishing sins to the 3rd and 4th generation, that there are consequences, right? Just like if you're in a smaller scale, if your relative incurs a debt, there's a chance that you inherit that debt and then you have to pay it off. And so there is this idea that in order to reconcile what Saul did to this people, there's kind of a retribution, okay? So that takes place, and then eventually, basically they take all of the bones of Saul, Jonathan, these sons, and they bury them all in Kish's tomb. That's Saul's father. And so that kind of really puts a close to the chapter of kind of Saul's legacy and impact within Israel. And then chapter 21 closes with some more battles with the Philistines. And we're told that David was fighting and he grew weary. And there's this giant named Ishbi-Benob. So he's one of the descendants of the giants. And he seeks to kill David. But then Abishai basically comes to his aid and saves him. And at that point, the people say that David should no longer go to battle. So we talked about kings often had a role in battle. And David would have saved himself a lot of problems if he would have been out in battle when the whole Bathsheba-Uriah situation takes place. But we see here that David's now growing older, and he's not quite at the same fighting stature that he once was. And so the people ask him basically, you need to protect yourself. You can't come out in battle. We don't want you to die. Or basically, you will quench the lamp of Israel. Like you are our light, right, leading us under God. And so we don't want you to possibly die. So you need to stay safe. And then we just have a little bit of a recounting of other giants. So again, this is these descendants, these large men that the Philistines had, these descendants of these giant people. And so we're told about more of David's men defeating them. And so we have Saph, who's one of the giants who's defeated. We're told about seemingly a Goliath, and it's interesting. We can't tell if this is basically a pseudonym for David's victory or if this is another Goliath. There's some debate on that, but regardless, we're told that he has this like huge spear. And then there's another man of great stature who has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. So we have this kind of not only giant man, but now one with like kind of 6 fingers and toes on every hand and foot. And he taunted Israel, but ultimately fell by the hand of David and by his servants. So David and his men, again, there's significance in that they are defeating foes who seem like they should be stronger. The difference is that God is on the side of Israel and not on the side of these giants. And so then chapter 20 opens up with this song of deliverance. I'm not going to go through it all, but I just encourage you to kind of soak it up. And it's this beautiful song where David is rejoicing in God's salvation. So many of the Psalms you've read are when David's on the run from Saul or David's on the run from his son Absalom. And it's beautiful to see this very much like a psalm song here in 2 Samuel 22, and it's about the Lord is my rock. He's my fortress, my deliverer. I called out to him and he saved me. And just kind of this beautiful rejoicing in God's provision and protection. And then in chapter 23, we're told that these are the last words of David. So we're closing on the end of David's life, and he gives this oracle, and he says, the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. Okay, so he's saying that the Spirit of the Lord, we call it the Holy Spirit, speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant. And he goes on and basically just talks about how those who oppose God ultimately will be bad for them. So this is interesting because in the story, David hasn't died yet, and we're going to see some more things he says, but we're kind of coming off that song of deliverance. We're kind of told him, by the way, this wonderful psalmist, here's his final words, his kind of final prophetic words that he spoke. So this is a good reminder. Not everything necessarily is chronological, but nevertheless, we're given kind of these big final words. And then coming off of that song, you have this kind of recording for us of David's mighty men. So we're told that David is a good fighter, he's a good king, he's a good leader, but we're also told that he has kind of a whole band of significant figures around him. So we're told about these kind of three that rise to their own kind of level of stature. So you have Josheb, Bashabeth. So we're told that he's kind of the chief of the three. So this is kind of David's chief fighter. He's the mightiest man he had. And we're told that he wielded a spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. So this Bashabeth, at one point with just a spear killed 800 people. So that's how good of a fighter he is. Next to him, we're told about Eleazar, the son of Dodo. And we have these stories. He, fought against the Philistines until his hand was weary. His hand clung to the sword, and the Lord gave great victory. So just fighting to complete exhaustion, but keeps fighting. And then we're told about Shammah, the son of Agi. And at one point when the Philistines were gathered against, there's a whole plot, like a plot of land full of lentils. And basically he stood in the midst of those when people were fleeing and defended it and defeated the Philistines. So these three are kind of this significant three that kind of stand above the rest. And then we're told about all these other ones too. And so I just invite you to enjoy some of these stories of these little previews of what these mighty men accomplished. And it's pretty cool when you read about it. One of my favorite is Benaniah, who we've talked about a little bit, but he at one point struck down a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. So apparently there was a time when it was snowy out and he finds himself in a pit with a lion and he defeats it. So again, just trying to capture some of these great victories. There's another time where he snatched a spear out of an Egyptian's hand with a staff. So he's fighting an Egyptian has a spear, he just has a staff, but he's able to use his staff to steal the spear and ultimately win. And then we eventually just get to a big kind of list of mighty men. And then interestingly, it ends with Uriah the Hittite. And then we're told there's 37 mighty men in all. So this adds new color to looking back. When you think of the whole Bathsheba situation, Uriah was not just a fighter, he's not just a member of this army. He was one of David's mightiest men who fought for him, who helped give victory. And I don't think it's an accident that he's saved for the very end. Here's these mighty men, and by the way, Uriah was one of them too. Nevertheless, kind of have this group of 37 in all. Now, in chapter 24, we have a very difficult story because we're told again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go, number Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab, the commander, basically, go into all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. That's a shorthand for saying the whole place of Israel, and number the people that I may know how many there are. So right off the bat, this raises a couple questions. The Lord is going to punish David for doing this, but the Lord is the one who incited him to do it. And this is going to add another level of complexity when we read the recording of this story in the book of Chronicles. But for now, I just want to reflect on this passage in 2 Samuel and what we're being presented with. The first thing we're told is that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So before any of this happens, okay, God is mad at Israel for something. Are they idolatrous? Did David do something? We're not really told, but we're told that the Lord is mad at something they did. It isn't told what it is. And so what he does is he, kind of like when he hardens Pharaoh's heart, he incites David to take an action that David maybe otherwise wouldn't do, and that's to take a census, which raises a couple more questions. First off, right, again, God's inciting him to do something, and then he's punishing him for it. And then also, we have the question of why is a census so bad? So I'm going to take those in two parts. First off, again, I think one of the best comparisons for what's happening here is to think about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, God hardening the hearts of Og and Sihon, and God sending an evil spirit upon Saul. Somehow, sometimes, God will, in his judgment, send a spirit to influence somebody negatively, right? So Saul, that evil spirit from the Lord, incited him to try to kill David, which he shouldn't have done, right? And this again gets to the whole complexity about God's working, human autonomy. We see throughout the Bible that people are always accountable for what they do, but that sometimes out of judgment for something prior, God will kind of nudge them or move them towards something that will lead to him making a point. So God is angry at Israel. He could have judged them by sending another famine. He could have judged them by doing a number of things. In this case, he chose to incite David to do something that David shouldn't do. And then as a result, there's going to be punishment for it. So we can still see that the action David did was wrong. He shouldn't have done it. And this is one of the reasons why always to be repentant, be in prayer. Lord, deliver us from evil. Lead us not into temptation. Not that God himself tempts us, right? The Bible says, but lead us from those things that we're tempted to do wrongly. Okay? So again, that's a tricky one. I'll fully admit this is a tough story to try and wrap our brains around. One of the questions, though, that we're still left with is, why is a census wrong? Like, what's wrong with David counting up how many people live in Israel? And I think to best understand this, I want to go back to the promise that Abraham was given when God had him look outside at night and look at the stars. And he said, number them if you can. That's how many descendants you're going to have. And the whole point of that was that you can't number them. The beautiful thing about stars is that when you are not in the city, when you're out and there's no light pollution, the stars are innumerable. And they're not meant to be counted. And like, all right, we got this one, this one, this one. The stars are just meant to be marveled at. We're just meant to just bask in their beauty. And so here you have David, this fulfillment has happened, right? Israel is numerous as the stars. Israel is powerful. It's grown. It's in the promised land. That Abrahamic promise has come to fulfillment, and it's not to be numbered and counted like, oh, let's see how great my kingdom is. Let's see how many people I have. It's just supposed to be marveled at. Wow, look at what God has done. Wow, look at all of the work that he has blessed us with. He's given us so many people, right? From Dan to Beersheba, from one coast to another, you could say. In the United States, this would be like saying from sea to shining sea. From Dan to Beersheba, look at all these people. Gosh, look at how good God is. It's not meant to be meticulously counted and quantified and kind of measured in that way. I think one lesson for the Christian church today is it's good. It's not a bad thing to keep track of how many people attend on a Sunday, how many members you have a part of your church. It's good to keep track of people so you don't lose sight of that. But when it comes to God's working in this world, we have to be very careful never to become too quantifying and say, look at all of the good stuff that I've done. And I've had this many people who have taken a step of faith. And I've had this many people who have shown forgiveness to their neighbor. Again, we can recount the stories. We should tell the stories, but we should, I think most importantly, marvel at the work that God is doing, right? Most of the work that God's doing is not easily quantifiable, right? When God talks about producing fruit in somebody's life, he's not talking about a specific number of things. Like how do you count patience, right? How do you count love, right? Some of the things that God is doing are not necessarily meant to be quantified, but just marveled at. I think there's a lesson in there if we were to really pull that thread. But regardless, this is the big problem when it comes to what David is doing. By taking a census, he's kind of saying, oh, look at how cool my big kingdom is. Let's see how many people I rule over, rather than just carrying out his duty and marveling at the work that God has done. And so Joab does go, and Joab kind of warns him and says, like, this doesn't seem good, but, may the Lord bless you, and may he bless you with more people under your kingdom. And so we're told that there's in Israel 800,000 that drew the sword. So that's, again, fighting age men. That's when we're doing censuses, we're usually just counting the fighting age men, how many could go to war in a given time. And then in Judah, there's 500,000. So again, you can fill out the rest. You have elderly, you have women, and you have children, all who are not in those numbers. But we have 1.3 million fighting age men across the kingdom. Now, I'll highlight for you, again, here we have two numbers, right? We have Israel and we have Judah. So we're already kind of getting an idea of the size of these separate groups, because that's going to come into play here in this week's readings. But nevertheless, the Lord is angry because of this. And David immediately, once he does this, he's struck to the heart and he knows that he's sinned. So he basically asks for forgiveness. And so he calls for his prophet Gad, it's one of the prophets, and the Lord speaks through Gad to basically give him three options. He can either have 3 years of famine across the land, right? Just like they had when Saul had committed those atrocities against the Gibeonites. He could basically flee 3 months before his foes. So think back to what happened with Absalom, right? When he had to run away and he had to flee from Jerusalem. Or there could be 3 days pestilence. So there could be a plague for 3 days in the land. And David feels terrible at all these. Obviously, none of those are choices you want to do, right? But this is a punishment. And basically, David rests on the idea of, I'll have a pestilence because that's completely in God's hands, rather than the hands of, right, some foes or some enemies. I don't want them to be attacking me. And famine's gonna, that could be severe. So basically, let's go in the Lord's mercy and we'll have a plague from him. And so the Lord sends this pestilence, and we're told from Dan to Beersheba, right, sea to shining sea, 70,000 men die. And that there's this angel that stretched out his hand to destroy them. So what I want you to see here is God kept his promise that I will not send the plagues upon you that I sent to Egypt if you listen to me, right? But when you disobey, those plagues that you witness, they're not partial. They don't just happen to some people. I'm going to punish you as well. Because you think back to the Passover night when God, inflicted death, and it was this angel, this destroyer that carried it out. Now we're seeing that happen to Israel as well. And so right after David counts up this big, mighty number, how big my kingdom is, then immediately God, in a lot of ways, humbles him by taking that number down. And the people ultimately have to bear the consequence from their king's sin. And David does plea and basically acknowledges that. He says, why should they have to be punished for my sin, right? I love it. He says, but these sheep, right? So you can see David, he was a shepherd boy, remember? He sees the people of Israel as his flock. And the Psalms will talk this way, that God made him a shepherd of Israel. He says, but these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's house. So David's saying, I deserve this. It shouldn't be them. And so Gad comes to David, basically has him build an altar, and at the place of Araunah, the Jebusite, he builds this altar on the threshing floor. And it's great because the guy is like, here, you just take, the stuff. And David's like, no, I'm not going to give an offering that I didn't pay for, right? I love that. Like, David's like, I'm not just here to check the box of an offering. I need to give up something, right? Because I'm the one who's done this wrong. And then ultimately the plague subsides and the killing is over. So it's a really challenging passage, a really tough story. Again, it raises questions like God's intervention and also human autonomy. And again, it's usually a mixed bag of both throughout the Bible, that we see God working and we also see people sinning and being accountable for what they do. On the flip side, it's a positive encouragement that a lot of times we don't even realize that the good that we do is actually God, I'll say, inciting us to do the good. That the Holy Spirit at work in us is leading us to do good things. They feel like our ideas and they are built off our past experiences, but God is the one nudging us sometimes to do those things. I typically find we're more comfortable with that. Like, I'm all for like Christ in me, God working through me. When God in his judgment, leads somebody to do something poorly, I'm less comfortable with that, but I think we kind of see God's working kind of in the midst of all of it, even while you have people responsible and autonomous for their own actions too. So challenging story, but nevertheless, in the end, there's this plague. It's subsided. And David, again, seeing these people as his sheep and asking for the guilt upon him and his house is a good picture of Jesus, who, though he did no wrong, looks upon sheep without a shepherd and basically says, I'll take the fault. I'll take the blame. Please inflict this punishment upon me. And ultimately, the curse and the pestilence of sin and death goes upon Jesus and is subsided from the people, kind of like what David's asking here. And that wraps up the second book of Samuel. So again, just a reminder, 1 Samuel is Samuel as judge and Saul as king. 2 Samuel is David as king, which should indicate for us now that we are closing the book on David's kingdom and David's kingship. And so as we open 1 Kings, which as you can imagine is going to cover quite a few kings, we're going to start with David being of old age. We're told that he's old and he's cold, but he can't get warm. So again, his body is weakened. And his servants have this interesting idea where they're like, let's get a young, beautiful woman that he'll want to lie with and she'll warm him up. And so they get this woman named Abishag, and she serves him. She is beautiful. She attends to his needs, but we're told the king knows her not. So David, wish you would have done this sooner, but David refuses to take her as a wife, basically. She's kind of ceremonial, or you could say like, in some ways, there's a certain aspect where she has been brought to him, quote unquote, as a wife, but he does not treat her as a wife in that way, right? He does not know her is the euphemism that the Bible will often use. So then because David is in his old age, we have Adonijah, who's one of his sons, who is setting himself up as king. Now, Adonijah has been mentioned before, back when we had Amnon and Tamar situation, and we had Absalom. When Amnon and Absalom are introduced to us, Adonijah is also in that same list in Samuel. So Adonijah basically starts setting himself as king and tells everyone that I'm going to be king. And we're told that the king never displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? Which means that David never disciplined him. David never challenged him in his folly, in his ways. And so this is a man who is not good in a lot of ways, right? This is the Bible calling out the problem of not disciplining children, right? In some way, shape, or form. You can't just let them have free range. They need to be obedient and curbed. But we're told that never happened to Adonijah. And so basically what ends up happening is he's setting himself up as king. He was born next after Absalom, so he's kind of next in line. And he confers with Joab, right? This commander who's been up to all sorts of stuff. So Joab's on Adonijah's side. Abiathar, the priest, he's on Adonijah's side. And they're going to help him as he prepares to be the king. But then you have Zadok, the priest, and Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei, and Ray, and David's mighty men. They're not with Adonijah. So we're not told exactly why, but they're not going with this one son. So you have a few that are, like Joab, like Abiathar, but then we're told that the rest of this crew is kind of like, no, we're not with him. We're not told why at this point, but long story short, Adonijah's inviting all of his brothers, the king's sons, all the royal officers, but he didn't invite Nathan the prophet or Benaniah, the mighty men, or Solomon, his brother. So he invites all of his brothers except for Solomon. And so we can already see what's kind of taking place here. Now what ends up happening is Nathan goes to Bathsheba and basically says, hey, Adonijah is setting himself up as king, and you and Solomon are going to be considered traitors, right? You think, again, when it comes to hereditary kingship, one of the dangers is you're always worried that somebody else is going to usurp you. Somebody else is going to take the throne from you. Especially, you can see this play out in world history. And as we'll see too, there was actually a promise that we're not told about yet, but there was a promise that Solomon would one day be king. So Adonijah is getting himself set up and he's ready. So that means Solomon's going to be a threat to Adonijah because David had initially promised that Solomon would be king. So Bathsheba comes to David and basically says, hey, didn't you say Solomon would be the king? And then Nathan comes in and says that too, and says that, hey, Adonijah is setting himself up as king. So what ends up happening is there's kind of this little sneaky moment where Nathan kind of takes Solomon, this is David's command, and he goes, and Zadok and Nathan and Benaniah, they take Solomon and they put him on David's mule. So who's going to be sitting on the royal mule on the royal throne, right? It's going to be Solomon. And they anoint Solomon, they put him on the throne, and they all cheer, "Long live King Solomon." And what ends up happening now is Solomon becomes king in David's place. He's now going to take over. And Adonijah is just left speechless. He's blindsided by all of this. So everyone who was with Adonijah basically trembles and rises. They leave, they flee. They're like, "Oh man, it's not good." And Adonijah now, he's worried that he's going to be killed, right? Because he's been trying to challenge this kingship. And so he goes to the altar and he grabs onto the horns of it. That's those on the corners of the altar. There's these horns. Basically, the idea of like, you wouldn't come and kill me in this sacred place. You wouldn't bring death and defilement to this place. So that's his way of protection. Basically, like, you wouldn't do that here, right? And so Solomon basically says that he won't kill him if he proves himself to be a worthy man. Then I won't do it. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Now that's interesting. Those are Solomon's first words in the Bible. But basically, he's saying of his brother, I'm not going to just kill him, but if he's wicked, then he will ultimately be punished for that. So then in chapter 2, we have David giving some instructions to Solomon. So here, this chapter is David's departure. So he's basically giving some encouragement, some wisdom as he's getting ready to go and basically pass on the kingdom to his son Solomon. So he says, "Be strong, show yourself a man, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes," right? Just as it's written in the law of Moses. So his first instruction is basically like, be a man and follow the Lord. I kind of love that. Be a man and do what the Lord has said. Follow his command as written down in Moses. Follow his statutes and things will go well. You'll prosper in all that you do if you do this, right? And it'll be great and it'll be a blessing to you. And then David has a really interesting next set of instructions, because after kind of this initial kind of blessing and encouragement, he asks Solomon to carry out judgment on a few people who deserved it. So first he talks about Joab, right? Because you know that how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner and Amasa. And he says, who he killed, avenging in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals of his feet. Basically, therefore, like, you need to punish him. You need to put him to death. So it's interesting. David never acted on this, but clearly David knew that Joab had brought about this punishment. He committed murder, which is punishable by the law by death. And for whatever reason, David did not see it fit to execute that under his own life. But now that he's passing on the torch to Solomon, he says, you need to go and carry out the judgment on the murders that Joab committed. You need to put him to death. Then he says basically to deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite. Remember, he helped David when he was on the run. And then he brings up Shimei, who is that one who cursed David when he was like on the run. And basically, David promised to him, I will not put you to death with a sword. But David's saying he does deserve guilt, right? Because ultimately the Lord showed that he was with David and that he brought David back. And so David promised that he would not put Shimei to the sword. He would not put him to death. But nevertheless, the guilt is still there, if that makes sense. And so it's kind of a weird one, but David is saying basically you need to carry out the judgment. And we'll see what that looks like here in just a moment, because it's not just like he's executed straight up. That's not how Solomon plays this out, but that's one of David's instructions. Basically, you're a wise man. Don't hold him guiltless. That's his words. Don't hold him guiltless. He was guilty of something. He deserves some sort of punishment. And then we're told that David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And in that time, David reigned over Israel 40 years, right? 7 in Hebron over Judah, and then 33 in Jerusalem over all of Israel. And so then Solomon sits on the throne of David, his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. So now Solomon is king. And the first thing that happens is Adonijah, his brother, who tried to make himself king, goes to Bathsheba and says, hey, could you make a request for me? Could you ask your son Solomon, my brother, for one thing? Can I have Abishag, right, as a wife? Who's Abishag? Abishag's that woman that they brought to David in his older years, right? Thinking like, oh, he'll lie with her and be warm, but David withheld from that. But nevertheless, what Adonijah is doing is he's trying to take, in a way, his father's wife or one of his father's wives as an act of usurping, right? As an act of establishing himself as king. And again, you can think back to Reuben did this. think back to a number of people. Absalom did this to David. This is a way of saying, I am taking my father's place. So I'm usurping him. And so this is not good. And so when Solomon hears of this, but his mom Bathsheba brings the request, but basically says, no, this is a wicked man. He's trying to take over the throne. He's trying to undermine. He's trying to cause wickedness. And so he's ultimately put to death. Then he deals with Abiathar, who's one of the priests, who again was on Adonijah's side. And so this is interesting. He does not put him to death, for he's a priest and he carried the ark, right, of the Lord before my father. So he realizes the holy role that Abiathar has had. And so he refuses to put him to death, but he does remove him from the priesthood. So he expels Abiathar from being a priest. And so he's not put to death, but he's no longer a priest anymore. And what we're told, this is crazy, is that this fulfilled the word of the Lord concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. So this goes all the way back to 1 Samuel, chapters 2 and 3, where Eli, because he refused to rebuke his sons and stop them from being, all their defilement in the tabernacle, right? They were sleeping with women at the gate. They were coercing food that they weren't supposed to be eating. They were just making a mockery of this holy worship. The word that the Lord spoke to Eli and then spoke again through Samuel was that the Lord would remove the house of Eli from the priesthood, that his part of the lineage would be removed. And apparently Abiathar was the final one in that lineage. And so even this playing out here is part of God's judgment on Eli way back at the beginning of 1 Samuel. So Abiathar is removed from the priesthood, and that's the end for him. And then we're told that Joab flees and goes to the tent of the Lord. So he goes to the tabernacle and grabs onto the altar, again with the idea of you're not going to kill me in here, this holy place. And interestingly, Solomon basically says, no, you need to go strike him down. If he won't come out, then you have to kill him. That's, especially if you think of temporal earthly judgment, you can't just play, hey, this is a safe zone where you can't touch me. Yes, this is a sacred place, but you have brought guilt upon yourself that you've never repented of. You've never done anything to reconcile, right? You've never even acknowledged. And so the fact that you're just clinging to it as if oh, you won't do it to me. Basically Solomon says, no, you need to go strike him down. So they strike him down and they take him out, and he's ultimately buried. And it's really interesting what Solomon says here, because he says basically that he killed with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself. Again, referring to Abner and Amasa. And then he says, so shall their blood come back on the head of Joab and on the head of his descendants forever. But for David and for his descendants, for his house and for his throne, there shall be peace from the Lord forever. So again, this idea of the blood coming back on his own head, the blood coming back on his descendants. Now, what's really interesting is when Jesus is on trial, okay? In the Gospels, Jesus is on trial, and Pontius Pilate does not want to put him to death. And eventually Pontius Pilate washes his hands of this. I'm not guilty for this, even though he's still complicit in it, so he is still guilty of it. But what the crowd of the people, of the Jews, say is, his blood be upon us and our children, right? We'll take they were so convinced that this was the right thing to do, right? This man needs to be put to death, that we'll take the blood guilt for him. Now, what they don't know is the beautiful reversal there is that his blood is actually healing, and it actually washes us. His blood does not make us guilty. So in some ways, they're simultaneously declaring the judgment that they deserve, but not realizing that actually this is the one person who, when you believe in him and trust in him and repent, his blood actually washes you. So you can see kind of the role of blood and violence having a role kind of coming back. This is what the people are saying to Jesus. Yeah, we'll take the guilt for his blood. We're just so convinced that this is right. And Solomon here is saying, hey, he committed murder. Their blood is coming back upon him. But for David, for his house, right, trusting the Lord, repenting, David also sinned. David also murdered Uriah the Hittite. And yet, because he repented, because he asked for forgiveness, there is ultimately blessing from the Lord forever, right? David still suffered earthly consequences, but eternally there is grace and peace. So then you have Benaiah, who now takes over the army in place of Joab, and Zadok the priest, who takes over for Abiathar. And so it's kind of interesting, kind of in each iteration, you have these different combinations of kind of leaders. And it's a little more fluid, but you think of you had Moses and Aaron, then you had Joshua and Eleazar, And then you had kind of Samuel and Saul. And you had David with Joab and Abiathar. And now you have Solomon, who's now running the show with Zadok the priest and with Benaiah, the commander of the army. Both men who were there before, just like Joshua was there with Moses, but are now kind of the head honchos of their respective departments. You have your king, you have your commander, and you have your priest. And then finally, you have Solomon's enactment on Shimei. So again, this was one of those things that David had commanded because Shimei had cursed David. So here's what Solomon offers him. Basically, if you stay in Jerusalem, I will not touch you. But if you leave Jerusalem, then your guilt will be upon your own head. You've brought judgment upon yourself. And so in some ways, this is almost like saying that this is your city of refuge. If you think back to the whole situation with Avengers of Blood, basically he's saying, as long as you're in this city, you're fine. Just don't leave the city. Shimei says, yep, I won't leave the city. But then after a couple years, he has a couple servants run away and he goes to find them and leaves the city. And basically Solomon says, I told you. Right? This was very clear from the outset. You swore that you'd remain in the city. So Shimei is eventually then put to death and kind of brought it upon himself in the end. And then as we get into 1 Kings chapter 3, we're told that Solomon makes a marriage alliance with the Pharaoh, so the king of Egypt. So he takes one of Pharaoh's daughters and brought her in as a wife and builds her a house, right? So it's interesting because we'll see this being ultimately the downfall of Solomon. But so for all we can tell, this is Solomon's first wife that is mentioned, but he takes this kind of powerful wife. And it was common back then to take a wife from another king as kind of an alliance. Like now we're kind of one family of sorts. So he does this with Egypt to make peace with them. Now that Israel is kind of firmly established and strong, we're told that at that time there's still there's still just high places. People don't have the temple to worship at, no house of the Lord, which that's going to be part of our reading this week. And then we're told that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places, right? Just as people had done before. But then at one point he's offering sacrifices at Gibeon. And then while he's at Gibeon, the Lord appears to Solomon in a dream and basically says, I'll give you anything. And I love this request that Solomon says. Solomon says, you have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on the throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of David my father, though I am but like a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind, and govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? I think this prayer should be prayed by everyone who's entrusted with the care in any sort of civil realm or spiritual realm. For every pastor, every governor, honestly, every parent. I love Solomon's prayer. God, you've shown me so much faithfulness. How in the world am I, but Solomon's like, I'm but a child, right? I don't have all the answers. I don't know what to do. I'm supposed to govern people made in your image. I'm supposed to take care of people that you care about. Grant me the wisdom and the discernment to distinguish between right and wrong and to know what I should do. And I highly encourage, if you ever are entrusted with the care of any number of people, this is a good prayer to use. So Solomon's prayer is fascinating because he could have asked for anything. And God is really pleased because he's like, you didn't ask for riches. You didn't ask for the life of your enemies. But because you asked for the right thing, you asked for what's best, and that's wisdom to serve me and to serve the people I've entrusted to you, I'll give you those other things too. I'll give you riches. I'll give you peace from your enemies and so on. And it's beautiful. It's very reminiscent of when Jesus will later say, seek first the kingdom. So yes, you're worried about, food and clothes and what you're going to, need for this life, but you follow what God wants you to do and the rest will take care of itself, right? We might not all have riches like Solomon does, but we'll be fine, right? We'll be adorned more beautifully than the flowers in the field, who are more beautiful than anything Solomon ever had. So I think you kind of this beautiful acknowledgement of God saying, this is the right thing. This is the thing you should be seeking first. Seek me, seek my face, seek my way and what I've called you to do. and then the other things will be taken care of themselves. So kind of a beautiful picture there. And then Solomon awakes, finds out it's a dream, and basically then he comes before Jerusalem and before the ark and offers burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. So he's thankful for God for what he's done in granting him all this stuff. So then we have the story that kind of puts Solomon's wisdom on display, where you have these two prostitutes who are not part of households. They don't have like their own, husbands to live with and such. So they live in the same quarters. And we're told that they come because one woman is saying, we both, bore a child, but she laid on her child. She accidentally rolled over and killed her child. But then while I was sleeping, she switched them. She took the dead child and she put the dead child next to me, and she took my living child and put it next to her, but I know that that's my child. And the other woman's like, no, mine is the living one, yours is the dead one. So, right, a he said, she said kind of thing. I guess she said in this case. And Solomon's wisdom is on display in that instead of trying to like interrogate them any further, which interrogation is never a bad thing, get more information, but Solomon instead says, how about this? We'll just cut the baby in half and you can each have half. And the first woman basically says, no, just give her the child. And the second woman's like, yeah, let's, neither of us will have him then. And Solomon clearly knows like the one who actually cares about this child is the mother. And so they give her the child. And people are just in awe of his wisdom. And we're going to see that continue to go forward as he has his wisdom in him to do justice, this wisdom of God. I'll say too, if you remember back when we were in the wilderness, one of the things that God promised for his people is that if you follow my statutes, people are going to recognize you as a wise nation, right? When you live according to how God wants you to, you're going to come across very wise in this world because he's laid out a lot of the fundamentals. And we're seeing that play out. Solomon is now given this wisdom from God, and people are in awe of it. And what we're going to see in a little bit is that people from other nations are going to come and want to see this wisdom as well, just like God had promised back in the wilderness. Then in chapter 4, we have a little bit of an accounting of who are some of the officials that work for Solomon. And then we're told that Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. So again, Abrahamic promise come to pass. And that they ate and drank and were happy. So you see they have provision, they have happiness, right? I'll say this, Solomon, especially in the early part of Solomon's reign, this is, you could say in some ways, the peak of the kingdom of Israel, the peak of the people of Israel. I'm going to use that in quotes because as we'll see, the New Testament redefines Israel in a way. But what we ultimately see is that when it comes to the people of God, this is what God had promised. You're going to be in a promised land. It's going to be fruitful. Things will be good. You'll have peace. You'll have plentiful. And right now, in Solomon's reign, we have that. They have a ton to eat. We have these accounts of how much food he has. He has like 10 fat oxen a day and 24 like fed cattle. I think it's like 6,600 liters of like grain every day. Like it's just crazy portions for him and his household, his employees, his workers, like just bountiful and rich. We're told that they have safety from Dan to Beersheba, right? From sea to shining sea kind of thing. They have peace on every side. They're to the point where they kind of rule over the Philistines and other neighboring groups to the point where those groups pay tribute. So in order to keep the peace, the Philistines and other groups have to pay Solomon a regular tribute. Here's some food or some resources. Here's some money so you won't attack us, okay? That's the dominance that Solomon's kingdom has. They have peace, they have plentiful, and they have this really wise king. And we're told that he has this just wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. So again, what did he asked for in his prayer to the Lord? This great numerous people, teach me how to govern them. And now the people are as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And good news, Solomon's wisdom is as wide as the sand on the seashore. Like God has given him the wisdom to oversee this beautiful and wonderful kingdom. And he's got all sorts of things. We're told that he's really wise and that he's got 3,000 proverbs. So we're going to read those in the Proverbs. He's written songs. So we got 1,005 songs that we're told about. He speaks about trees and animals and just all sorts of things. So he's observant. He's just got wisdom all around, right? I guess like a modern term would be a true Renaissance man in some way. He just this all-encompassing knowledge. And then in chapter 5, we're told that Hiram, the king of Tyre, so this is this very commercially advanced, powerful city, kind of to the northwest of the people of Israel. We're told that he sends servants to Solomon when he hears that Solomon had now taken over. We're told that Hiram had always loved David. And basically, Solomon sends word to Hiram and says that, hey, you know that my father David could not build a house in the name of Yahweh, his God, because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. So basically, like, David was always in battle. He was always fighting. So he couldn't build a temple like he wanted to build. So if you remember, the Lord told David, you're not going to build me a temple, your son will. We weren't told why at that time he couldn't build a temple, but now we're told that one of the reasons was because there was warfare. There was, bloodshed, and David was in exile and stuff, that the Lord had kind of appointed this for this next season of peace to be the one where the temple is built. So Solomon basically says, I'll pay you, but can you give me, cedar to be sent to me to build this? I'll pay you for your servants. And so I'll pay all of your workers if you can send men who are skilled and send resources. And Hiram ultimately hears this and he rejoices and says, blessed be Yahweh this day. It's interesting because Tyre doesn't necessarily, they're not all people who believe in Yahweh, but he rejoices and says, blessed be Yahweh this day, who has given to David a wise son to be set over this great people. So again, even Hiram can see just how wonderfully wise Solomon is. So then after this, we start to prepare for the temple. Now, David had started a free will offering for the temple, but now Solomon's the one who's actually kicking things into gear. So he's drafting labor. So he's using people to work for this. There's about 30,000 men who will be working, and they'll go in a shift is a month long, and there's 3 shifts. So 10,000 people go up to Lebanon, up north. They'll work there for a month. Then they'll come back home. Another 10,000 will come up. So you have 1 month on the job, 2 months off the job. So it's hard work. But then you have 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country. So you have all of these. And then you have even 3,300 chief officers to help oversee the work. So you have this whole complex, this whole system to help make the temple and help get the things. So at the king's command, they carried out great costly stones. So again, these are valuable. They're not cutting corners on this temple. Okay, Solomon wants to do this thing right. He wants to make a house, quote unquote, worthy of the Lord. I'll say it that way. And so they lay the foundation with these stones, right? They get these builders, and they're preparing all the timber and the stone to build this house. And then in chapter 6, we have the beginning here of the actual building. And so we're told that this is in the 480th year after the people came out of Egypt. So just to give you a picture of Exodus 15 to right now, 480 years from the time they got out of Egypt, through the wilderness, into the promised land, through the period of Judges, through Saul and David, and now 4 years into Solomon's reign, we're at 480 years, and now they're building the temple. And so it's incredibly large. We're told it's 60 cubits long, so it's about 90 feet long and about 30 feet wide. So this big temple, we're told that basically the Lord comes to Solomon in a word and says, concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So basically he's saying, if you follow my statutes, you walk in my way, I will not leave, right? This temple you're building, this will be my dwelling with your people. And we're going to see this is a very important feature, especially the temple dedication, in terms of the significance of the temple and what this represents and what this is for the people of Israel. Then we're told more about what it looks like. And so we have these, we have cedar, beautiful wood. We have all sorts of decorations. You have the cherubim in the inner sanctuary, so the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. So again, if you remember, in the tabernacle, that was that room where the ark is. So they're basically making the tabernacle into a temple. Where it was a movable tent, now it's going to be a stationary temple. And so it's going to be designed in much the same way, but just a grander scale. Now that they're firmly set in the promised land and they have all these resources. So they build the Holy of Holies. Now you have 2 cherubim, a little bit different. Instead of in the tabernacle where the cherubim were facing each other on the mercy seat where God dwells, now they're kind of facing out. So you kind of wing to wing. So they're kind of standing side by side or sitting side by side there. We're told that the poles kind of stick out. But again, this is a holy sacred place, this kind of inner place where I remember only the high priest goes on the Day of Atonement. So you have this inner sanctuary. You have all sorts of imagery. As you go through the temple, just think of, you have gourds, you have open flowers, you have cherubims and pomegranates. And again, I mentioned this previously, but when you think of the tabernacle and when you think of the temple, you should picture a garden of sorts. This is in a lot of ways, this is the Garden of Eden in the midst of the people. Okay? So in the Garden of Eden, you had cherubim. Adam and Eve walked with the Lord. And there's all this like plant life. As you go into the sanctuary, you have pomegranates and gourds and flowers and angels kind of depicted, or cherubim depicted. And so again, it's kind of this Garden of Eden in the midst of the people where God dwells with his people. Just like the Lord walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, where is the Lord with his people? He's with them in the temple. And then we're told it ultimately takes 7 years to build. And so it's quite the endeavor, right? It takes 7 years of this meticulous building of, shifts going up to cut wood and stone cutters and crafters. But ultimately they finish the temple. And then Solomon builds himself a house. It takes him about 13 years. It's called the House of the Forest of Lebanon because it's this huge, massive thing. Its length is 100 cubits. So it is interesting. His palace is bigger than the temple because his house is 150 feet long and its breadth is 75 feet long and it's 45 feet tall. So this massive palace for himself as a king. And you have these rows of cedar pillars and these beams, and it's just kind of this awe-inspiring place. And I'll put a link in with some renderings of kind of just, again, what this looks like as you're trying to picture the temple and trying to picture Solomon's palace. And so you have this big place. He also makes a place, kind of an own house for Pharaoh's daughter. So she has kind of her own little mini palace of sorts. And again, it's all costly stones. It's all cut to measure. It's all taken care of significantly. It's just this beautiful thing. And then we come back to the temple a bit, and we're told that Hiram is brought in to kind of see this work. And we have these bronze workers. And again, we're just kind of given this picture of the furnishings now. All of the work done to make lattices and make what's called the sea, which is this giant basin that is where you kind of wash. If you remember, there was kind of this big tank to like kind of wash in for the purposes of the tabernacle. Now we have what's called the sea because it's so massive, and it's on 12 oxen. And we're told that there's these big pillars. One's called Jachin and one's called Boaz. Now those are both names that have come up before. Jachin is one of Simeon's sons, going all the way back to Simeon in Genesis. And Boaz is the husband of Ruth in the book of Ruth. But I think more significantly than who those figures are, I think it's probably based off their name, because Jachin means he will establish, and Boaz means the strength is in him. So these two pillars in the temple, that's the Lord is the one establishing this, and he's the one who is the strength, right? The strength is in him. And so you can just kind of see all of these different just ways that the temple symbolizes God's might, his glory, his beauty, right? Because one of the significant things about the temple compared to other places of worship, other temples from neighboring nations, is that you do not have a depiction of God. I want to highlight that really clearly here in the temple. One of the things that distinguishes this temple from other places of worship at the time is that you do not have a depiction of God, right? You don't have a pole, you don't have a statue, you don't have a little idol that you rub or pray to, right? Whereas God, he's seated in this cloud on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies, but you don't see him, right? You don't have a statue of him. And that's hugely significant for a variety of reasons that we'll see going forward. But if you remember God's command not to make a graven image of anything to worship, right? The only thing you worship is God, and you can't see him, so don't make a little idol of him or of anything else. We see that the temple doesn't have an idol of God. It doesn't have a depiction of him, but it has all these other artworks, all these other depictions and drawings or carvings that are helping show the majesty and the glory of God. So it's capturing an essence of who he is and truth about him without actually depicting him. I'll also just highlight while we're here that there's these panels that have depictions of lions, oxen, and cherubim. And I just highlight that because later when we get to the book of Ezekiel, we're going to have cherubim that are going to have those three kind of creatures depicted along with a fourth. But you start to see some of those images pop up here and now. And then we're told that Hiram, as part of this, he's making utensils. So for Solomon, so he makes pots, shovels, basins. Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon. Again, you have all of these things, and just, again, I'll put a link in the description, but just so much beauty, so much grandeur. Solomon finishes the vessels, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of presence, the lampstands of pure gold. So not just gold plated, but pure gold, right? And you have all these different things, the Holy of Holies, everything that goes in there. And so ultimately this work is finished and the temple is completed. Again, a 7-year project to build and to make all of this, but now it's finished. So then in chapter 8, you have this big moment. And maybe if you had to pick a high point in Old Testament Israel's history, this would be the high point. Because the Ark of the Covenant is then brought to the temple. We're told that the Levites brought it, which is good. Remember, they're the ones who were supposed to be carrying it. They're not supposed to put it on a cart, like when Uzziah died in David's day when he was bringing it up to Jerusalem. So the Levites are carrying it, all the holy vessels. They bring it up. We're told that they start sacrificing thanksgivings, right? Praise sacrifices and stuff. And it's so many sheep and oxen that they can't be counted. I mean, just imagine that if just everybody is like, here, I want to offer a sacrifice to the Lord too. Here, take this one too. I want to give thanks to the Lord. So just this innumerous amount of sacrifice and praise and thanksgiving to God for what he's done. And the ark is then put in the holy place, right? And the poles are kind of sticking out. So it shows you kind of how small this thing is. We're told that now there's nothing in there except for the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put in there at Horeb. So those 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, those are in there, but nothing else is. And that now the priests come out of the holy place, and then a cloud filled the house of the Lord. So the priests could not stand and minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. So again, this happened in the wilderness, right? Pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, and then with the tabernacle where God's glory from the mountain kind of descended upon the tabernacle and went into the tent of meeting. So this is God saying, yes, I dwell in this temple. This house is my house, right? So this is one of the reasons why the temple is so significant, because the temple from here on is the embodiment and it is the place of God's presence amongst his people. Now, God is omnipresent, right? He's everywhere, but in a very unique, particular way, God has said, I'm most specifically in this temple. If you were to ask the question, if I want to go find God, where do I find him? At this time, you'd say, go to Jerusalem and go to the temple. That's where God is. That's where he has put his name. That is where he dwells. He dwells in that temple over there. So this temple is huge, and it's a very significant part of Israel's history. And I highlight that because the New Testament's going to run with temple language. Well, the temple is going to play a role even in the Old Testament, but then especially in the New Testament, understanding the role of the temple, this place where God dwells with his people, this place where God is to be found, this place where God is to be called upon, that is all wrapped up in this temple. So then Solomon blesses the Lord and, gives him thanksgiving. He recounts the words of the Lord and how he brought him out of Egypt and the promises he made to David. And so he's, again, kind of retelling the story in a sense. And then Solomon stands before the altar and spreads his hand out over them and basically gives them kind of this dedication, this kind of blessing. It says, O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept with your servant David, right? My father, who you declared to him. So again, he's saying there's no God like you who makes promises and keeps them and keeps these relational covenants and fulfills them. It's just remarkable and showing steadfast love. And then he recounts that there's this promise that David should not lack a man to sit before God on the throne of Israel, which again, we're going to see that's going to seem to go away for a period, but then ultimately there is one, Jesus, who is of David, who's going to be this king to reign forever. But then he acknowledges too, like, how crazy is this? But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. Yet have regard for the prayer of your servant and to this plea. And so I love it. Solomon's saying, God, I know that you're not like a human being. You don't like need a house. You're greater than the heavens and the earth, right? Those are made. You're not made, God. You're beyond those even. And yet you have chosen to make your name here. So regard the prayers, right? When somebody prays to this house, right, offers their prayers, hear them. When a foreigner hears of your name, so again, Israel's not just an ethnic thing, it's a faith thing. When a foreigner hears of you and they come to this temple and they offer sacrifice and prayers, hear them, receive them, forgive them. When one sins, forgive their sins when they pray. And then Solomon, calling back to the warning in Deuteronomy that if you don't listen, you'll be in exile. Basically, Solomon says, and if our people are scattered amongst the nations, but they pray towards this temple, so from wherever they're scattered, they pray towards this temple, hear them and bring them back. So acknowledging that things might get grim, but please hear us and be willing to bring us back. He knows that exile is a possibility. And so you just have this huge blessing, this fulfillment. You have more sacrifices, and the people all leave knowing how blessed they are. They know how blessed their king is and how blessed they are as a people. And then in chapter 9, following this dedication, you have the Lord appearing to Solomon a second time. So he came to him in Gibeon. He's now coming again, and he's basically saying, I've consecrated this house. Yes, I have made this house holy. This is my dwelling. Follow my word. And he says, if you don't, right, if you go serve other gods, then I will cut off Israel from the land, and this house will become a heap of ruins. So don't turn from me. But yes, I'm with you. I am made my presence with you, and this great, great blessing. We're told then of some more things that Solomon did. He had, 2 houses, the Lord's house and his house. We're told that he'd given the king of Tyre 20 cities up in the land of Galilee. And Hiram didn't really like these cities. Just goes to show you that Israel, it has this beautiful temple now and this beautiful palace, and Solomon's very rich, but most of Israel is not the most advanced cosmopolitan, whoa, look at this place, right? Again, what sets the people of Israel apart? It's not that they're more cultured. It's not that they're more sophisticated. It's that God dwells with them. So when Hiram gets to these cities, he's kind of what? This is it? We're told about how Solomon builds up the city of Gezer because when Pharaoh is going to give his daughter to marry Solomon, at this time it was culturally to give a dowry, which is a gift and finances along with the bride. And so, it's just a major flex for the Pharaoh to basically let me go capture a city and destroy it, and I'll give it to you as a dowry price for my daughter. So just again shows just kind of the wealth though and the power that Solomon has at this time. And we're told that he also has a fleet of ships. And so they kind of go out, and so again, you can see trade becoming more of a thing. They're bringing all sorts of gold and such. Then we're told that the Queen of Sheba, which is, there's a couple different theories of where exactly this is referring to. The Ethiopian church will say that Sheba is in reference to a place down there in Ethiopia, a former queen down there in Africa. I think the leading belief is that this is an area in Yemen, so just south of Israel. If you kind of go down to the Arabian Peninsula, this is an Arabian place. But regardless, you have this queen who hears of Solomon's great wealth and wisdom. She comes up to check it all out, and he answers all of her questions. She can't, everything that she wonders, he has an answer for. She sees how plentiful and bountiful it is and ultimately blesses him, and basically is wow, the Lord is great to you. And then we're told more about Solomon's great wealth. I'll just say this. I think one of the biggest things that shows you how wealthy he is and how well things are going right now is that we're told that in those days, silver was considered as nothing. So Solomon has so much gold that silver is oh yeah, it's silver. We got plenty of it. It's nothing, right? That's just how wealthy he is and how wealthy he is there in Jerusalem and his kingdom. Again, that doesn't mean that every person is wealthy everywhere, but every person has peace and has enough. And as we were told a little bit earlier, that there's peace on all sides, and that everyone sits under their own fig tree. That's an important biblical image for peace. That you can sit under your crops or your trees, and you can eat from them without fearing, right? Nobody's going to come take this from you. And so they have peace. We're told about this really cool throne in his house that has its ivory and it's overlaid with gold. And then it has 6 steps with 2 lions on each side. So 12 lions, presumably for the 12 tribes of Israel. So just a super cool looking throne. And yeah, we're told that silver is as common as just rock. So just really cool, all that's going on. But, right, I told you the temple is kind of the high point, right? This is, this is the best thing. This is Israel's height in the Old Testament. And then it already starts to go south. We reach the mountaintop, and now it's time to go down a bit. Because what we find out in chapter 11 is that King Solomon loved many foreign women. Along with the daughter of Pharaoh, he loves Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittite women. And from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. So that's a quote back from when they were getting ready to go into the promised land, right? In Deuteronomy and to Joshua of like, you don't marry with those people because they're going to turn your hearts away from the Lord, right? So there's two big issues here Solomon's doing. One, he's marrying people that God had commanded him not to marry. And two, he's not supposed to be taking multiple wives, right? This was one of the things in Deuteronomy that Moses said was, if you have a king, they should not take many wives. Because Moses knew, God knew, that's what kings like to do. They have so much power, like, oh, I'll take a wife from over there. I'll make an alliance with this group and take another wife from over there. And you get kind of drunk on power and alliances, and marriage means nothing to you, so you take a bunch of wives. And so he had forbid kings from taking multiple wives. Now, again, David had several, not good. Well, he had more than that. He had a number, but we're told that Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines, which is kind of another relationship. You can kind of consider it another wife of sorts. It comes with a little bit less standing, I'll just say it that way. But for the intents and purposes now, he takes 1,000 women, so 700 and 300, 1,000 women, and all of these women from different places and faiths. And we're told that they do exactly what the Lord said. They lead him astray. They lead his heart astray. And we're told that even though the Lord had appeared to Solomon twice, right? When he first came to him as king and then after the building of the temple, Solomon nevertheless in his latter years turned from the Lord, which is just atrocious. And he goes and he starts offering sacrifices. He builds high places for Chemosh and Molech and the Baals and all of these different, and Ashtoreths, right? Milcom, all of these different gods. He starts building places of worship for them because of his wives who are like, oh, I need to worship my God, and you should build a, temple or a high place to worship, Asherah or whatever. So you see Solomon led astray. This is like what happened, if you remember the story in Beth Peor when the people were in the wilderness in Numbers, and the Midianites intentionally had their women seduce and marry some of the men in order to lead them astray into idolatry. This is what's happened to Solomon now. He has married all these women. And again, I just want to stress the core issue here is not like xenophobia. It's not like, oh, well, they're from a different place. The key issue is that he is marrying into people who worship a different God. That's the key problem. That's what the Bible always means by kind of equally yoked marriages. The problem with marrying Canaanites is not that they're ethnically different. We're trying to be ethnically pure, right? Rahab joins the people. That's a great example. The key is a faith issue, that God's people have always been called to marry those who also are going to lead you towards God, further towards Christ, not away from you, right? So that's the problem going on here. And so what ends up happening is that the Lord is angry with Solomon, and he ultimately raises up adversaries. So again, we had peace, and now we have adversaries. And basically the Lord says to Solomon, I'm going to tear the kingdom from you, but for the sake of David, I will not do it in your days, but I'm going to tear it out of the hand of your son. Also, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give you a tribe to your son. So basically he's saying, you've lost it, right? I was telling David, I'll establish your throne forever if you follow me and obey my commands and worship me. And then Solomon doesn't do that in his latter years. And so the Lord says, all right, you forfeited the kingdom, but because of David, you'll still get a tribe, and I won't do it during your lifetime, okay? So basically then at this point, you have these different things rising up. You have an adversary, Hadad, who's an Edomite, who is from the royal house in Edom, and he flees to Egypt. We're told that during David's reign, but now he's come back. He's kind of been raised up by Pharaoh, and he comes back to kind of rebel against. We're told it is adversary Rezon, who is of the house of Zobah. And so he's kind of going around, and he's a king in Damascus. That's in Syria. And then we have an adversary within Israel itself, and we have this man named Jeroboam, who's an Ephraimite, so from the tribe of Ephraim. And he's a servant of Solomon. He serves Solomon, But what ends up happening is the Lord sends a prophet, Ahijah, who comes to him and basically tells Jeroboam that the Lord's going to give you part of the kingdom. So he takes this cloak and he breaks it into 12 pieces for the 12 tribes, and he gives 10 of them to Jeroboam and says, God's going to give you 10 tribes, and you are going to be king, Jeroboam, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, this is the Lord speaking through Ahijah to Jeroboam, and will walk in my ways and will do what is right in my eyes, as David, my servant, did, I will be with you. So Solomon goofed. Solomon has turned to idolatry and departed from faith towards the Lord. But the Lord is now saying to Jeroboam, who is this man of Israel, I'm going to give you 10 tribes. And basically, if you do what David did and follow in my ways, you will rule over and things will be good, right? It'll be prosperous, just like the promise was for David and Solomon. Solomon didn't do it, but now he's given Jeroboam a chance. Now, as soon as this happens, Solomon seeks to kill Jeroboam because he views him as a threat. So Jeroboam runs away to Egypt. It's a very common thing. So he runs to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was there until the death of Solomon. And then as chapter 11 wraps up, we find out that this is the end of Solomon. Solomon dies. We're told about the book of the Acts of Solomon, which we don't have. But again, it's kind of one of those extra biblical texts that's referenced, that this seemed to exist at the time, and that he reigned over Israel 40 years. Just like his father, David, 40 years. He sleeps with his father, and he's buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam, his son, reigns in his place. And so now we hit the high point in the kingdom. Solomon has now turned from the Lord and has died, and now is where things are going to get real. I mean, they're already interesting. Now they're going to get maybe a little bit harder to track, but we're going to do our best to follow through on this. So, who's the king now after Solomon? His name's Rehoboam. That's Solomon's son. But we have somebody with a confusingly similar sounding name, Jeroboam, who God has anointed to be king over Israel. So after Solomon dies, Jeroboam comes back. Rehoboam goes to Shechem, and everyone's going to kind of make him king, right? It's like an inauguration, right? Let's make Rehoboam king. And what the people say is, Rehoboam, your father put heavy burdens upon us. Please lighten up, right? So one of the things, Solomon was a time of prosperity and peace, but the people are saying, we worked hard on the temple, on your palace. Like, that was hard work. And so we're asking for you in your reign to lighten up, not to put so much work on us as your people, right? One of the things that Samuel warned the people was that, their sons would be drafted into wars and stuff, and your resources are going to go to the king. They're saying, hey, can you just lighten up a little bit? So Rehoboam kind of goes with his counselors, and he talks to the wise old men who were there during Solomon's reign, and they say, listen to the people. If you listen to them now and give them what they want, that you promise to go easy on them, they'll love you forever. But then Rehoboam asked the young guys who he grew up with, hey, what do you guys think? And they're saying, no, you need to double down. You need to show them how serious you are so they fear you. And so you need to tell them that my pinky is thicker than my father's thigh, right? Like, you thought that was hard. Like my father might have whipped you with whips, but I'm going to whip you with scorpions. Like, it's just go over the top and kind of impose your will upon them. And Rehoboam listens to his buddies. He listens to his young men and not to the wisdom of the older men who grew up alongside Solomon. Now, again, this is one of those really interesting human action, divine action, because we're told that this is part of how God is working out the fulfillment of what he told Solomon, that the kingdom would be removed from his lineage, right, in your son's days. So this is partially God working in Rehoboam to take counsel in his young buddies. It's, their counsel itself might be from the Lord. It's also Rehoboam's foolishness to, instead of asking the wise elderly men who have lived some life, ask his kind of young buddies. That's kind of what's going on here. So what ends up happening is basically Rehoboam listens to his young buddies. He basically says, hey, I'm not going to go easy on you. He says, I'm going to be harsh. I'm going to be hard. And then what ends up happening is the people respond by saying, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now after your own house, David. Now, if that sounds familiar, that is basically identical to what Sheba said when David came back out of exile. He tried to lead a rebellion of Israel away from David and basically said, what portion do we have in David? What inheritance do we have in the tent of Jesse? each to your own tents, O Israel. Okay, everyone to yourself. We don't need you. We're going to do our own thing. Where that time, because of David's steadfastness, God did not allow the kingdom to be split. Now, God is actually going to intervene and tell Rehoboam not to try and stop them. So he sent the taskmaster to try and kind of bring them back, and they stone the taskmaster. He's the messenger. I mean, literally, you think of like, don't shoot the messenger. It's kind of like that. He's there to kind of discipline them, bring them back in. They kill him. And then we're told that basically the Lord says to Rehoboam, this is the Lord's working. Don't stop this from happening. So now what you have is this divided kingdom. And I say this because this is how it's going to be from here on. So we had all these tribes. We had King Saul, who was over all of Israel. Then we had David, and then we had Solomon. From here on, you have two kingdoms. And this is huge to understand the rest of the history of this period and the rest of the history of the Old Testament, is that from here on, you have a northern kingdom that's called Israel. And it's confusing because Israel is not the one that descends from David. Israel is the other tribes. And you have a southern kingdom called Judah that's going to follow in David's lineage. Now, we've been trying to prep for this and take note that of all the times where it's like how big Judah is, and times where like the census would be like, here's how many are in Israel and here's how many are in Judah, right? But now here we see an official split, and it's going to remain split for the rest of the course of this, okay? So northern kingdom, Israel, southern kingdom, Judah. Now, one thing that's a little bit of a confusing detail is that the tribe of Benjamin ultimately pairs with Judah. So you have 10 tribes, Ephraim, Asher, Dan, Reuben, Manasseh, all of those. And then you have 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, who go by the collective name Judah. So kind of interesting one, but partially geographic and stuff. You have Judah, southern kingdom, Israel, northern kingdom, and now we have a split kingdom. We have 2 different kingdoms going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the show notes a graphic from Bible Gateway that kind of walks you through all the kings, and it has a lot of information in there. You don't need all of it if you don't want it, but it is a helpful tool to kind of line up timelines, because one of the things you're going to see going forward is we're going to kind of take these king by king, and sometimes you're going to do 2 kings of Israel in a row, and then a king of Judah, then a king of Israel, and then a couple kings of Judah in a row. And so sometimes it's hard to keep track of how these all line up. I'll do my best to help you, but from here on, you have 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel, who now has King Jeroboam, right? The one that Ahijah gave those pieces of cloth to. And you have southern kingdom of Judah, which is really Judah and Benjamin, who's under King Rehoboam and is going to follow him. And it's the lineage of David. So just so you know, from here on, we got 2 kingdoms, and we're going to be spending the rest of this episode just kind of touching base on all of the different happenings as we go forward in these 2 kingdoms. And we're not off to a good start, because as soon as Jeroboam gets control of the northern kingdom, so Jeroboam is now the king of Israel, he has this thought. He thinks to himself, we're supposed to go worship in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Man, every year, like 3 times a year, all of my people are supposed to go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. If they do that, their hearts are going to go back to Judah and say, oh, we should go back to how things were, and we should go back to, the kings and David's lineage and stuff. And so what Jeroboam does is he sets up 2 golden calves. He takes counsel, he makes these 2 calves of gold, and he says to his people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. So he's trying to put these kind of in different parts of the northern kingdom, so people will now make their worship centered in one of these 2 places, either in Bethel or in Dan. That's where they're going to go up to. They're no longer going to go to Jerusalem for all of the feasts. Now this is, if those words sound familiar, behold, O Israel, the gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, it is a direct quotation of what Aaron told the people when he made the golden calf in Exodus 32. So when the people turned from the Lord into idolatry and made a golden calf to worship, they made a golden calf, and they said, this is now the gods who brought us up out of Egypt, right? This is the one who's delivered us. And so Jeroboam not only makes one of them, but makes 2 of them. So you can just see the terrible atrocity of all of this, like how quickly Jeroboam has turned from the Lord, right? Because he was given the same promise. Like, if you listen to me and you follow my ways, it'll go well and you'll, rule over all that your soul desires. But now we're told that he's turned from that already. He's more fearful. Here's the big key. He's more fearful of preserving his political and social control than trusting in the Lord. Because if he trusted in the Lord, he would say, the Lord gave me this kingdom. I can do things the Lord's way. I'm going to trust the Lord. I'm going to have people worship the Lord, and it'll be fine. But instead, he tries to outsmart God and say, hey, God, they're going to be led astray. So if I want to keep them under my control, then they can't be going to worship someone else, or they can't go and worship somewhere else. They have to stay in my territory, and they have to worship these golden calves. And then we're told he even goes so far to replicate feasts. So again, he's trying to kind of give them a new normal. And then he starts to make temples on high places. He appoints priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites, right? This was one of the issues we ran into in the book of Judges, right? The priests are supposed to be from the lineage of Aaron, which is in part of the Levites. So he's making all sorts of people priests who are not supposed to be, and they're ultimately offering sacrifices as they shouldn't be doing, okay? So then in chapter 13, we're told that this man of God comes up out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, where Jeroboam is standing by the altar to make an offering. And so this man of God, who just kind of comes out of nowhere, we don't even get a name, he basically tells Jeroboam that one day somebody named Josiah is going to tear down this, that these high places will be destroyed. This altar will be basically burned down, torn down, and Josiah is going to sacrifice on you, that is the altar, the priests of the high places who make an offering to you, and human bones shall be burned on you. So we have here this prophecy that one day somebody's going to come in named Josiah, and he's going to destroy this high place and this altar that exists. Now, Jeroboam's mad, so he reaches out to kind of attack him or accuse him, and then his hand kind of shrivels up, and he pleads with the man of God, and his hand ultimately, the man intervenes and asks God to restore Jeroboam's hand, and it is restored. But nevertheless, this is a key point because this is a promise that the Lord has spoken through a prophet that one day he's going to tear down this terrible thing in Bethel, and it's going to come from a man named Josiah, who, as we'll see, will be a later king in Judah. And then just to show you how just kind of rough things have gone already, it feels a little bit like we're in the book of Judges. So Jeroboam implores the man to stay, and the man says basically, hey, I was told not to eat bread nor drink water. I was here just to proclaim this word, and the Lord strictly forbid me from stopping to eat or to drink, but I need to head back now. So he starts heading back, and then we're told that there's this old prophet there in Israel who hears about him, chases him down and says, hey, you should come and eat bread with me. And, the man of God says, hey, I was told not to stop to eat bread or drink water. And he says, oh, an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord saying, bring him back to your house. But he lied to him. So this old prophet lies to him, and we're not sure his exact motivation, but basically tells this man of God, you need to come eat with me. And the Lord spoke through an angel. And I think this is a really good example of you need to trust the word of the Lord, right? So when we talk about what God has clearly stated, you should never take the word of somebody else who says like, oh no, God told me blank, if it goes against what God has clearly said. Now, most of us, like this man of God, have not been given a divine command not to eat bread or drink water, but we have been told certain things about how to live, what to believe, how to worship, things like that, worship God in spirit and in truth, to be baptized, to take communion, all these things. If you ever have a word of the Lord, some divine revelation that contradicts it, it's not the Lord. This is why Paul will go so far to say to the Galatians, if anyone comes to you with a gospel different than the one that you received, right? The gospel of Jesus received, by faith, given in grace. If anyone comes to you with a gospel different than that, even if it's me, even if it's an angel from heaven, don't listen to him, right? You got to hold on to the truth and not just be swayed by any messenger. So what ends up happening is this man of God listens to this old prophet and says, all right, I guess, God told you to give me some new instructions. He goes back to the man's house, and then the Lord does speak through the old prophet and basically says that you've disobeyed, and because of it, you lost your life. And so when the man of God goes back out on the street, he eventually gets killed by a lion, which is just a crazy sight. And when the prophet comes out, he just sees this like sees the donkey, he sees the lion just sitting there, and then he sees the body of this man of God. And he didn't, tear it to pieces or anything with the donkey. He just sits there, the lion does. And so then the prophet basically takes him and buries him in his own grave and cries out, "Alas, my brother." So again, things are just rough right now, right? Things are not good. And then we're told about Jeroboam does not turn from his evil ways, but he made priests for the high places, again, from among all the people. Any who would, he ordained to be priests of the high places. And this thing became a sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. So Jeroboam, again, anyone who wants to be a priest can be a priest. And that sounds nice. We live in a world where we like to tell people you can be anything you want to be. Well, one thing is in the Old Testament, anyone who wants to be a priest cannot be a priest, right? It's not just anyone who wants to gets to be it. And I'll just say this is, in the New Testament, this is true of pastors. There's requirements, there's expectations in 1 Timothy and in Titus about what qualifications there are for a man who desires to be a pastor. It's not meant to be just anybody, but there's certain qualifications. Now, the difference being that those are not of a lineage, where in the Old Testament, there's a specific lineage. You must be part of the Aaronic, that is of Aaron, Aaronic kind of descendancy, okay? So anyways, Jeroboam's sins are bad, which leads us to chapter 14, where Abijah, that's Jeroboam's son, gets sick. And he tells his wife and says, "Hey, go disguise yourself and go talk to the prophet Ahijah." Now it's confusing because we have Abijah and Ahijah, but Ahijah was the prophet who told Jeroboam that he would have the kingdoms. Okay, he's the one who gave him the little pieces of cloth and said, "Here's your 10 pieces. That's your kingdom." So now Jeroboam's like, "Oh man, my son's sick. Hey, go talk to Ahijah and ask him to help him." So Jeroboam's wife comes in, and Ahijah, even though he can't see at this point, he's so old, he's told that Jeroboam's wife is there. And so he basically calls her out, tells her he knows exactly who she is, and says that he is, the Lord is saying to Jeroboam, "I exalted you. I put you as a king over Israel, but you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all of his heart." And so basically he says that this son is going to die, but more remarkably, this son is going to be the only one buried in a grave, that kind of dignity of being buried in a grave, because the Lord's now going to cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will burn up the house of Jeroboam as a man burns up dung until it is all gone. Right? So this son of yours, the Lord has found something pleasing in him. He's going to allow him to kind of die naturally of this sickness and then be buried. But just so you know, it's not going to be that nice for everybody else in your household, and your household is going to be cut off. And so then what we end up having is Jeroboam's death. So their son dies. We're told that he, warred and reigned, and you often have these little summary statements at the end of these kings' lives. So for the rest of the kings, and this was true of Solomon too, you're going to have a little summary statement usually at the end of their life. And it kind of has the similar format, saying something to the effect of the rest of the acts of fill in the king, in this case Jeroboam, how he did this. He warred and how he reigned. Behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. And we will read Chronicles later in this reading plan. That is a book that we have. And then we're told that the time that he reigned was 22 years, and he slept with his father, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. So that's the end of Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. He's now dead after 22 years. So now we're going to jump to the southern kingdom, because we were just following the northern kingdom with Jeroboam. Now we're going to jump to the southern kingdom with Rehoboam. And we're told that he reigned 17 years, but that under his leadership, Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So he's not any better here. And he provoked the Lord to jealousy more than all that their fathers had done. So things are getting really bad, right? Rehoboam doesn't just goof up by not going easy on the people at the beginning of his kingship. He fully jumps into idolatry, because they build high places, pillars, asherim, that's Asherah poles and stuff, on every high hill and under every green tree. He institutes male cult prostitutes, which seems to be a Canaanite tradition, that one of the ways you would worship these deities is that you would engage in sexual activity with a cult prostitute. So this is not a practice that the Lord wants. This is not a practice that the Lord has commanded. He's forbid it, and now they are doing it. And so they do all these abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out from before the people of Israel. This is important. So all those abominations that got people kicked out of Israel, right? What are the people of Judah now doing? They're doing those same things. And as we go forward in the book of Kings, we're going to see that that has consequences, just like it did for the people who lived there for generations before. Only so long can the people go on this way unless something changes. And we're told that during King Rehoboam's reign in the 5th year, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the treasuries of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made, and Rehoboam had to put shields of bronze in their place. So you see this kind of diminishing of the kingdom already. We talked about the high point with Solomon. Now these like golden shields that were part of, Jerusalem's glory, now they have to be bronze shields. So there's a diminishing here going on. Their golden age, pun intended, has already come to an end, and now we're in kind of a rough patch. And then we're told more about Rehoboam, kind of that wrap-up statement. You can learn more about him in the book of Chronicles. There's war between him and Jeroboam continually, and then he dies, and then now Abijam, his son, reigns in his place. And the way that these timelines work is whoever's the next king to get started is the next one we focus on. So we did the northern kingdom with Jeroboam, but he reigned 22 years. Then we did the southern kingdom with Rehoboam, but he only reigned 17. So now we're going to go to Rehoboam's successor first, because he's coming in 17 years later, where Jeroboam's successor comes in 22 years later. So that's one of the confusing things as you go through. Sometimes kings are going to be mentioned. It's going to feel like out of order, but it's basically just whoever the next king is to start their time. That's who we're going to talk about next. And we're going to talk about their whole reign. Kind of makes it easier to classify kings rather than a linear timeline, to kind of say, let me talk about Jeroboam and all he did. Great. Let me talk about Rehoboam and all he did. Great. Let me talk about the next king of Judah, and so on. So we have Abijam, who begins to reign. He only reigns for 3 years, and he walks in the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord, so he does evil. He does not walk in the ways of David. But for David's sake, the Lord still gives him a lamp in Jerusalem, meaning he's not removing the house of David from the kingdom of Judah, even though Abijam is not doing well. So he's not good. He does not follow the Lord. And so eventually he dies, and his son Asa takes over. So Asa takes over, and he does what is right in the eyes of the Lord. So this is our first good king since David / the beginning of Solomon's time. So Asa did what is right in the Lord. He puts away the male cult prostitutes. He removes the idols that his father made. He removes his mother from being queen mother. So often that was a pretty prominent role at this time for the king's mother. She would have a lot of influence and power. But he removes her from her office because she makes an abominable image for an Asherah. And he cuts down the image and burns the image. So again, you think of all the people in the Bible who they're good. They do a lot of good things, I should say. But when a loved one sins, they don't handle that properly. Asa shows his righteousness in that he removes his mom from her place of prominence in office when she turns to idolatry, right? We can't have the king's mother in this prominent role leading people astray. So he removes his mom from that office, which is a good thing. And then we're told, though, he does all these things. He removes the cult prostitutes and a lot of the stuff, but the high places are not taken down. So those are still sticking around. Those are a problem. You're going to see that those remain for a while. But nevertheless, his heart was wholly true to the Lord all his days. And he brought into the house of the Lord the sacred gifts of his father and his own sacred gifts, silver, gold, and vessels. So the king of Egypt had stripped those treasuries. Now Asa is starting to replenish them a bit with some of this silver and gold. Now we're told that at one point there's a war between Asa and Baasha, who we have not met yet, but he's going to become king of the northern kingdom. And Baasha starts to build this town called Ramah to kind of cut off travel routes to Jerusalem. This is a strategic move to build a city on the way to Jerusalem, so Jerusalem can't trade, it can't get help, it can't flee as much. And so Asa takes then the silver and gold that he had put in the treasuries, and he gives it to Ben-Hadad, who is this man over the king of Syria in Damascus, and basically says, hey, let's make a covenant agreement. You break your covenant with the northern kingdom, and you come attack them and get rid of the city of Ramah. And so again, this is Asa's one big blunder, is that he kind of opens up this relationship with Assyria, and has them break their covenant with Israel. They had a peace covenant with the northern kingdom. And he does so by paying through the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So instead of just trusting that the Lord will take care of them, he instead gives up these treasuries to Ben-Hadad, who comes over and basically stops Israel from building Ramah, and Judah then is able to destroy the city and get back to the rest of their work. And then we have the closing out of Asa. We're told in his old age he was diseased in his feet, kind of an interesting little detail, but that he slept with his fathers, buried in the city of David, and that Jehoshaphat would take over. So then we go back to the northern kingdom now. We have Nadab, who is Jeroboam's son. He begins to reign, but he only reigns over Israel for 2 years because he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord and in the sins of his father, right, with those golden calves and idolatry and such. So Baasha, we've already kind of met Baasha briefly in Asa's recounting. So Baasha, he's not part of that lineage, but he conspires against Nadab and has him killed while he's attacking the Philistines. So Nadab is besieging this town called Gibbethon in the Philistines, and basically Baasha comes over and conspires and kills Nadab for what he has done. And so Baasha takes over then kind of as king. He becomes king in the place of the house of Jeroboam. So this is a fulfillment back to chapter 14, that the house of Jeroboam, nobody would be left because Baasha goes and kills all the house of Jeroboam, right? So there's nobody left breathing. This is what was spoken by Ahijah, and that the sins of Jeroboam have come to roost in his family. So then Nadab, so he's done. Now Baasha is in control, and he begins to reign. He reigns for 24 years, so he has a pretty long reign as well, much like Asa. And he does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. So he now is walking the way of Jeroboam. So he's part of the judgment against Jeroboam's household, but he's not better. He continues to do those same things. So the word of the Lord comes to Jehu against Baasha and basically says, hey, I exalted you out of the dust and made you a leader over my people, right? The same thing he said to Jeroboam. I brought you up from the dust and made you a king, and now you've done all of this. So now your house will also be like the house of Jeroboam, right? That same judgment's going to come upon you. And so, long story short, eventually anyone belonging to Baasha is eventually going to die. He is killed, he dies, and then the word of the Lord comes by Jehu against Baasha and his house because of all this evil. And we have Elah, who is the son of Baasha, taking over in his place, but he only reigns for 2 years because his servant Zimri, who commands half of his chariots, conspires against him. And at one point when Elah is kind of drinking himself drunk, basically Zimri comes in and kills him, strikes him down, and then reigns in his place. Now when he began to reign, as soon as he had seated himself, he struck down all the house of Baasha. So again, he's worried about that hereditary kingship, but it's also carrying out the judgment that God had pronounced against Baasha. So Baasha's whole household is out of the way. Zimri's destroyed them. And they were told that Zimri only reigned 7 days, but basically the troops, when they find out what had happened, they say, hey, Zimri conspired against and killed the king. So Israel made Omri, who's the commander of the army, king over Israel. And so now you have kind of this battle between Omri and Zimri for kingship. And ultimately, Zimri, when he sees what's going to happen, he goes into the king's house and burns the king's house over himself with fire and dies because of the sins that he committed, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking the ways of Jeroboam, for he committed. Now, he only had 7 days, so clearly not that long, but he clearly was not even on the right trajectory. So Omri steps in. Now, Omri is a name worth remembering. You don't have to remember all of these kings, but I'll highlight the ones that are really helpful. It's good to be somewhat aware of the name Omri. We're told that at this point, half the people follow this guy named Tibni, half follow Omri, but ultimately the people follow Omri, overcome. So Omri takes over, and we're told that he's the one he builds a city called Samaria. And so that's going to be a significant thing because for the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria is going to become a very important centerpiece. It's sometimes just used as a stand-in for that region. And we're told that Omri did more evil than all who were before him. So you got your worst one to date, your worst king. He walked in all the way of Jeroboam and in the sins that he made Israel to sin. And then eventually when he dies, his son Ahab takes over. And Ahab you definitely want to remember because Ahab is, as we're going to see, He did all the evil that Omri did and more than everybody before him. As if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, he also took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians. So taking a wife he shouldn't take, who, as we're going to see, is going to cause all sorts of problems. And he went and served the Baals and worshipped him. And he erected altars in the house of the Baal. So he's building in Samaria, this new capital, he's building altars and temples to Baal, this false god, this foreign god. And we're seeing kind of the evil play out. And we're going to follow Ahab for a little bit. But you also see that the problems in Israel are growing, because then at the end of this chapter, we're told that there's this man, Heel of Bethel, who rebuilds Jericho. Now, again, this was the first city that God judged on the way into the promised land, the first city that God tore down. And at the end of that encounter, Joshua had proclaimed in Joshua chapter 6 that if anyone were to rebuild Jericho, at the laying of its foundation, you'd have to give up your firstborn, and at the placing of its gates, you'd give up your youngest. So to rebuild Jericho, there was a curse put on it that you're going to lose 2 children. So nobody rebuilt Jericho. Like, why would you do that? It's a city that God judged. There's a curse upon it. But what does this man Heel do? He rebuilds Jericho, and in doing so, he lost his firstborn and his youngest son, which was foretold way back in the beginning of Joshua. So here we just see the overall, just the wickedness, the sin, the depravity of these kingdoms. We've split, and what we're going to see going forward is there's going to be some kings that are in Judah that are good, and some kings that are bad. In Israel, they're going to be, I'll be honest, pretty much all bad from here. We'll have one kind of brightish spot. But nevertheless, now we have 2 kingdoms that are warring against each other, warring against other nations, and having all sorts of kingdom problems. As we wrap up today, I want to respond to a listener question that is something I probably should have talked about in one of the episodes, but I'm glad that this was sent in. So here's what the question reads. When the Bible says things like, "It is still that way today," what time frame are we talking? Just before Moses' death? Because he was the author. This would be the case of the first 5 books traditionally. So a relatively short period, a man's lifetime, long as Moses' life was. Okay, so basically the question is, there are these times where you'll see phrases that in that day, this happened, right? Or this is how it was back then, and it still's there to this day. You see this all over the place. And I think specifically this is referencing at the end of Deuteronomy, when we're told that there was nobody like Moses to this day, right? And there's something special about Moses to this day. Now, traditionally, we attribute that book to Moses, so that seems like a funny thing for Moses to write on his deathbed. And there's been nobody as great as me, or as meek and faithful as me until this day. And it's like, well, that's right now, right? So that's no different. So the question is, what time frame is that referring to? You can also see things like that when you look at the book of Ruth, and you see in chapter 4, there's this whole situation where Boaz and this other man, they have an exchange of rights, and they hand over a sandal in the midst of it. And we're told explicitly this is how things were done in Israel in that day. So it's telling us that this is not being written down, that sentence at least is not being written down at the time of its event. Because if it was happening contemporarily, you wouldn't feel the need to say back then, right? Because back then is right now. So this gets to a bigger question. Just when you find things like that throughout the Old Testament, there's a bunch of them, and I could list others, where it seems to be commenting from a later period. Who wrote that? How do we make sense of that? And I think this is where maybe some of us, this gets a little uncomfortable, but when we look at the scriptures, so traditionally there's books that are attributed to certain authors. Like I said, first 5 typically attributed to Moses, Joshua typically attributed to Joshua, except for the very ending when he dies. That's attributed typically to somebody, probably Eleazar, just kind of finishing out the book. But then you have other ones that are a little bit more murky, often different prophets and such. And sometimes we just don't even, especially in the Old Testament, we just don't even know who supposedly wrote this, right? And there's different traditions, different authors that are typically ascribed, and different theories and different conversation. But I want to specifically address those notes when it seems to be reflecting on a time later than the book is written, or that the book's events take place. You'll see this with city names, that it'll say back then it was called blank, but now it's called this, okay? And I think the best way to understand that is that likely throughout the ages of these scriptures being recorded for us and passed down, there were times where scribes would add a little note to help clarify for the reader and say, hey, back then, right? So let's take that example in Ruth. So originally that story takes place and probably written down for us. A lot of people attribute the book of Ruth to Samuel for writing it down. Let's say it was for this sake. So Samuel writes down the book of Ruth. Well, it wasn't that long ago from Samuel's lifetime to the events of the book of Ruth. So at some point, a scribe, when copying that book, might have added to the reader, at that time, this was the custom that you hand over a sandal. So they're trying to help somebody understand. Or again, for place names, they're trying to help a later reader understand, oh, this is what this place was called, but here's where it is now, right? So this is like when you're reading ancient history and something comes up and it's like, well, this is in modern day Turkey, right? So back then there was no country of Turkey, but that's helping us kind of situate it in the context we know. So sometimes you have this commentary that's given by these scribes or from different people to try to help us make sense of it. Now, for some of us, right, that feels very startling, right? Especially because, I hold to a belief that the scriptures were inspired by God, commanded, by him through the Holy Spirit, working through these prophets and these authors. And so how do you make sense of a scribe? Can God work through a scribe where things changed? And I think a lot of it is a really good question. And I think we certainly hold that as they were originally written, God orchestrated all of that and worked through these authors, right? So they're writing with their own human voice, their own human perspective, but also with this kind of divine voice behind all of it. And then I think for me, the simplest way to understand these Old Testament, I'll call them little commentary pieces, is that those are what are inherited by Jesus. So in Jesus's day, when he is doing his ministry, the scriptures include those comments, include those sentences. And those are part of the scriptures that he says, those are the scriptures that bear witness to me. So Jesus is saying those scriptures, including those little comments and stuff, how they come to him, that's part of what bears witness to him. The New Testament is a whole nother conversation about what do we consider scripture, what gives it authority. All of that is really good. And I can get into that another time. But especially as we think about the Old Testament, I always think it's most helpful to start with Jesus. I was talking to somebody fairly recently, and they said one of the frustrating things about Christianity is that it feels like you have to start with the assumption that the Bible's all true, then you can go from there. And they're like, well, I think that's circular reasoning. And one of the things that I tried to highlight is, as Christians, we don't start with the assumption the Bible is true. Now, I think that is accurate. I think the Bible is true. But we start with, who is this Jesus guy? Oh, man, he died and rose from the dead. We should listen to what he said. Oh, and he said that those scriptures, those 39 books that we call the Old Testament, are all there to point to him. Oh, then we should take those with authority. And he says that, the Spirit was speaking through David and so on. So it's through Jesus that we see the authority of the Old Testament scriptures really come into focus. And so when we have moments where it's like, I can tell that this sentence was not written at the exact same time as the rest of this book, does that mean somebody changed it along the way? It might be that a scribe added something, tried to clarify something, but I think that we can take everything, through the lens of Jesus and say, however it came about, when Jesus looked at that book, he said, yep, that bears witness to me. That's authoritative. And so we say, okay, sounds good. We believe that too. And that gives us a little bit of room to wrestle with, but I think that's helpful. So that's one of the reasons why it's helpful to look at the Hebrew text. It's helpful to look at, in terms of scholarship and some of these questions, what's called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is probably the primary Old Testament language that the people in Jesus' day would have known, and seems to be what Jesus is mostly referencing when he's quoting the scriptures. So we're going to look at those kind of questions and say, as far as we can tell in Jesus' day, what did the scriptures say? What did they say? And we have confidence that they carried back and they continued to go back farther and were, fairly accurate. Obviously, there's little scribal, missteps here and there at times. One of the beautiful things is we have lots of manuscripts, especially in the New Testament, that we can kind of compare to get a good picture for what the original said. And so we do our best to look at all the what's called the manuscript evidence of what were these words. But when you come to things like that, where it's like, I can tell that somebody later added a sentence to clarify something, I don't think we have to freak out, because at the end of the day, our confidence rests in Jesus, who looked at those books that we're looking at and said, yep, those are about me. Those bear witness to me. Those are written through the Spirit. And so we say, great, we'll take them as they are too. And there's a whole group of scholarship that, again, is trying to wrestle with what do we do when there's two manuscripts that seem to differ a little bit in this word or that word. But those differences never make any sort of big theological difference. They never make any sort of big difference between like, oh, is God really one or is there many gods, right? Like those kind of differences, they're just usually grammatical little tweaks or here that we're trying to make sense of. But at the end of the day, our lens is Jesus. He looks at those books. So even if there's a later comment, even if there's something that seems to be from a different time period than the original events or the original document, in Jesus' day, he says, yes, that's about me. That's authoritative. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any other questions about the canon, what we call the 66 books of the Bible, if you have questions about different textual manuscripts or how we make sense of copying and scribes and their role in all of that, and again, in its relationship to our belief in Scripture's authority, feel free to send any, and I'm happy to talk about that at length or follow up on any other questions. But hopefully this was just a little bit of a primer. When in doubt, let's look at how Jesus views these Scriptures, and especially when we start with the Old Testament, Jesus says, those are about me, those are authoritative, and we say, great, that's how we'll view them too. All right. Hopefully that was a blessing. I hope you have a wonderful week reading. And as you go about your day, I want to leave you with this blessing. May the word of Jesus renew you day by day until life everlasting. Take care.